two bumblebees here that are going to be probably great pollinators. This is a smaller sweat bee. This is a honeybee. They're less cold adapted, so they're going to be less available to Haskap as a pollinator. So getting into the research that we're planning on doing, we kind of have two separate chapters that we're wanting to work on. So we want to look at aspects of the flower, so different floral attractants, floral characteristics that are relevant to pollination, and then we also want to look at the behaviors of the pollinators that are visiting Haskap. Today I just want to talk mostly about the pollinators, just because I don't want to be talking forever, and the rest of the stuff we haven't quite nailed down yet. But we've done some work with the pollinators, and we have basically 4 main questions that we can ask about the pollinators and that I can hopefully answer. I'm not going to answer them all today. Today I'm just going to talk a lot about concepts. But the main thing we want to know, so who are the Haskap pollinators? Who are the visitors to the flowers? And of those visitors, who are the most effective as pollinators? And who's the most efficient as pollinators? And effective and efficient, very close words. I'm going to define what I mean by them in just a little bit. And then lastly, I want to be able to kind of have sort of a practical output of this. I want to be able to tell you guys, if you have this many Haskap plants, how many bees do you need in order to maximize pollination and maximize your fruit set? So, this orchard probably looks familiar to the image. So last year we did a bit of a pre-field season. When I started this project, as I said, I knew nothing about Haskap. I didn't even know what the flowers looked like. So we went out and we just ran some basic experiments. We tried to get a feel for things. And basically just try and get an idea for what are the bigger questions that are out there to be answered. So this was last year, and some of the stuff that we did manage to get was a good list of what's visiting the crop. So this is a big list. All of these guys here, these are all bees. This is a fly. I was actually practicing this presentation for my mom yesterday, and she went, wait, there's more than one kind of bee? And so, yes, there's lots and lots of kinds of bees. Most you probably might not even recognize as a bee. Lots of different social behaviors, so honeybees are very social. There's others that are partly social, ones that are totally solitary. So I just wanted to give you guys an introduction to the different visitors, the ones you might see in your crop. So one by one here, we have Apis mellifera. This is, again, your honeybee. You guys are probably familiar with them. They're very social. Their main appeal as a pollinator is that they're abundant and they're easily available. So if you have your crop blooming, you don't have many pollinators, you can just go grab a hive, throw it in the orchard, and they're going to go nuts on it. However, they are a non-native species, so they're actually native to Europe, which means they don't really like cold. They're kind of a fair weather pollinator. So they're going to come out on really nice days, and from what I observed on the field, they really like Haskap. They do a lot on there, but again, we don't always have perfect conditions when Haskap's flowering, so it can be kind of hit or miss with them. Osmia lignaria, this is the blue orchard bee. This is another managed species, so you can actually order them. They're a little different because they're solitary, so one female manages a nest by herself. They're only active for about 6 weeks in the spring, and their active period coincides really, really nicely with Haskap. And they are a native species, so you can order them, but you do find them in the wild here, which means they're very cold adapted. So compared to the honeybees, they're going to be active at cooler temperatures during windier temperatures. They would be a little bit more reliable when we have not so reliable weather conditions. These are bumblebees, so the genus Bombus. These were by far the most abundant of the native pollinators that we saw, so we had really good diversity too, so about 10 different species there. At this time of year, it's only bumblebee queens that are out, so they haven't established a nest yet, they don't have any workers out, so it's just the queens out there foraging. A few different examples of them, so this is Bombus ternarius. They have the really nice orange band, they're really pretty. Bombus nevadensis. These ones are huge, the queens especially, even the workers are very, very large. They have this distinctive dot in the middle, they're very large. We always joke that they kind of sound like a Harley as they fly past you because they're so big and loud. Bombus terricola. This one's actually pretty interesting because it's a species of conservation concern. It's in decline over most of its range, but when we were doing this work up in Birch Hills, this was by far the most abundant species, so Haskap's really good for Bombus terricola, so that's good news. These are your sweat bees, your halictid bees. These guys, they're called sweat bees because they say they land and like kind of drink your sweat. Never had that happen, but it's a reason because of the reason for the name. They're very, very small. So this is a picture of Halictus rubicundus. You can see that's the stigma of Haskap, so the bee. So very, very small. But he's very covered in, she she, I guess, is very covered in pollen, so she's probably doing a really good job of moving pollen around. These weren't very abundant. It's hard to say exactly how common they were in the orchard because they are so small. It's hard to detect them, so there could have been more than we saw. But they're not quite as cold tolerant because they're small. They can't regulate their temperature as well as bumblebees. But they were definitely out there and doing some pollination work. Lastly is Syrphidae, so family Syrphidae. These are your syrphid flies, flower flies, hover flies. They don't collect pollen. They visit flowers mostly just for nectar. But they do get pretty messy on the flowers, so they can transfer pollen around quite effectively. For some crops, we did some work with sour cherry last year, and we think that these guys are probably one of the major pollinators of sour cherry. So kind of a little bit, people don't think of flies as pollinators, but they really can be. So now that I have this list.
Are these bees you actually found, or are they just the ones that could be there?
These are ones we actually saw visiting the flowers, yeah. There's a few other species that we saw in the orchard, so some andrina, they're mining bees. We saw them around, but we didn't see them on the flowers, so I didn't include them in the list. There's also things like cuckoo bees. They're actually parasites. We saw a lot of them in the orchard. They don't actually visit flowers for nectar. They're actually parasites of other nests. So it was really good that we saw them because it meant that there was good bee populations for them to be able to parasitize. But yeah, these are the ones we actually saw on the flowers. So now that I have this list, I want to be able to basically rank them and tell you which, on a per individual basis, who is the best pollinator of Haskap. And I mentioned the terms effectiveness and efficiency. So these words, they've been used kind of interchangeably within the literature to mean any number of different things. These definitions that I'm going to use and that I have up here were proposed by Newman et al. In 2010 just to try and get people all on the same page. So these ones I'm using. Effectiveness is just the movement of pollen. So it refers only to how well a pollinator moves pollen from the anthers to the stigma. Efficiency has to do with how well that pollinator actually contributes to fruit set. So they're not necessarily the same thing, and I'll kind of give you some examples of how they're different. There's various indirect measures that people have measured pollinator performance. So abundance, pollen load, stigma touches, visit duration. These have been shown to not be great, so just because an insect's spending a lot of time on a flower doesn't always correlate to better pollinator efficiency or better fruit sets. So they're not the greatest, but last year, they're easy to do is why they're used a lot. So we did a little bit of this last year just to get a kind of basic idea about who was actually pollinating. So we looked at pollen load composition. So this gets at the idea of floral constancy. So if we look at the pollen that's on the body of a pollinator, if it all belongs to Haskap, if we catch the bee off Haskap, all the pollen belongs to Haskap, that means that when it visits a Haskap flower, it can only deposit Haskap pollen on there, which is good. If we alternatively have a bee that's covered in dandelion pollen and he visits Haskap, obviously if he puts dandelion pollen there, it's not going to help you at all. So with our bumblebees, you can see right here, this is the pollen load on the bumblebee, and they pack it into a nice little package there. So for these guys, we didn't want to sacrifice them at all because they're queens, they're establishing colonies. We need lots of these in order for there to be lots of bees later in the season. So we actually just captured these guys in a net. We used a little toothpick and combed off that little pollen load, and then we could analyze the actual composition of pollen load. For blue orchard bees, so Hamish had brought in some of these guys. You can see a little bee there. And these are what the blue orchard bees nest in. So in each of these tunnels, they go in, they build up a pollen load, they lay the egg on it, they seal off the chamber, they make another pollen load, lay an egg, seal off the chamber. And so it was easy enough to watch them coming and going, and we could just pull the pollen directly out of the nest and see what they're bringing back. For the honeybees, because they're very abundant, and for sweat bees, because they don't have the pollen load that we can easily take off, we had to actually sacrifice them and rinse off the pollen and see what was carried on their whole body. So this is what we would end up with. It's a nice picture like this. We mount the pollen in fuchsia jelly, and the pollen absorbs the purple dye. And the nice thing about pollen is you can tell what it comes from based on the structure, the physical characteristics of the pollen. So all this little stuff in here, this is all salic, so willow pollen. These big guys, this is the Haskap pollen here. So this was off of an osmiae, obviously. They're almost all willow. When you see something like this, it usually means he's collecting willow pollen, but he might be visiting Haskap just for nectar and not actually collecting the pollen off of it. This is the data we ended up with there. So this is percent Haskap pollen in the pollen load on the y-axis, and the different species here on the x-axis. These here, there's 5 different species of bumblebees that we got samples from. This is all the bombus grouped together.